Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for the invitation. And thanks also to the people who are online. So I will stay here because I have to go on with the presentation. So let's say that I will talk about 30, 40 minutes, as I was told. And then we can open to questions. I'm about to present this working paper that is titled Evidence-Based Policy with Context-Based Evidence, the case of behavioral public policy. So it's quite different from the work that I'm used to, because usually I do empirical research, while this is more like a conceptual paper, and it's in a preliminary stage, so I'm happy to get feedback and to get questions, so please do it. Now, first of all, something about why this paper exists. So I would say two main starting points. One is my research, so somehow this paper is a broad reflection about my research area, which is behavioral public administration. And here I tried to put, I hope you can read the slide, it's a bit small. So I put a few main essential elements that I think are part of behavioral public administration. So first of all, behavioral public administration, those who work in behavioral public administrations try to take a micro-level perspective to study public administration, meaning the individual is the main unit of analysis when studying public administration. And another essential element is that the premise, one important premise in this area is that individuals do not behave like they should, you might say. So they don't behave according to, like, consistent with, you might say, rational models of behavior, meaning neoclassical standard models of decision-making, like expected utility theory, for example. And another element which is important in behavioral public administration is this use of RCTs, and increasingly also of mixed methods. And I do this in my research, so that's why today it's a bit different. Second starting point is my teaching. So at LSE, I'm convening this course in policy advice in theory and practice, which is about how social scientists, scientists in general, and evidence can be used to improve policy making. I would say whether and how it can be used. Evidence can be used to improve policy making. And there are a few sessions are on specific tools that can be used in policy advice. One of these is about RCTs. And so with students, somehow we try to question the fact that RCTs are the gold standard of research. And another session is about nudging. Nudging, which is probably at least now, the most famous behavioral strategy when applied to public policy. So nudging, for those of you who are not familiar with nudging, is it's also called the libertarian paternalism. So this idea that you can change the choice architecture in order to affect policy outcomes for good. So basically, by changing the environment in which people make decisions, you can change the outcome of those decisions. But people are still free to choose whatever they want, basically. So these are the two main starting points, I would say. So reflecting upon this idea that evidence should be used in public policy, in policy advice, to make it better, to make public policy better, as applied to my area of research, behavioral public administration and behavioral public policy. Now, in terms of the specific messages of this paper, the goal is to analyze challenges to evidence-based policy using the specific case of behavioral public policy. And I will make two main arguments that will be clear as we go on with the presentations. One is that it's difficult to identify without any ambiguity evidence in the first place. And to do that, I will compare two different theoretical approaches: bounded rationality approach, which is the one that is mainly used in behavioral studies, with the ecological rationality approach, to argue that the same facts, the same factual observations can be interpreted differently depending on the theoretical premises. And the second argument will be that even when we have evidence, then the decision on how to use that evidence is highly dependent on the context. And here I will use cultural theory by Mary Douglas. So this is the paper in a nutshell. Before going through these two arguments, something about the background. So first of all, what is evidence-based policy? And let's say that it's a kind of a process that encompasses two main sequential elements. The first one there is that is about producing credible evidence about what works, hopefully by rigorous research methods, very often RCTs. And second element, once you have produced evidence, using that evidence to direct resources towards interventions that are shown to be effective through research. So this is what is meant by evidence-based policy. Now, the literature has already identified challenges that might hinder this process. Here I selected a few challenges that have been identified in the literature. One is the two communities thesis. So basically this idea that social scientists and policymakers belong to two different communities. They use different languages, they respond to different incentives, they're interested in different questions, and so there is no way that they can understand each other effectively. And so this is one challenge to the process. Second challenge, political institutions in our modern democracies were not designed to come up with evidence-based policy, but to come up with policies that are consistent with the will of the majority, you might say. So it's not necessarily the case that the right policy is the one that is recommended through evidence, but it's the one that is coherent with the political institutions that exist. So this is the second challenge. Third, by Carol Weiss, this distinction between the engineering model to public policy and the enlightening model. So according to Carol Weiss, we should not think in linear terms, meaning the academia is not there to produce conclusive evidence about specific policy issues, but the academia has an influence over policymakers that is only indirect through theories, through concepts, through ideas. And so we should think differently about the impact of research on public policy. Last challenge that I put there by Lindblom and Cohen, another distinction, this time between ordinary knowledge and scientific knowledge that they also call professional social inquiry. So basically they argue that ordinary knowledge produces a huge amount of information compared to what we can do in terms of scientific discovery. And whenever you try to solve any issues, including policy issues, you need a huge amount of ordinary knowledge to solve issues and to deal with problem solving in general. So professional social inquiry is just a tiny part of knowledge that we use in implementing public policy. And so these are the challenges. Basically, I want to try to add something about this list of points. And so first, the case that I will use to make arguments about challenges to evidence-based policy, behavioral public policy, as the attempts of using behavioral insights to improve public policy. It's quite fashionable now. If you go on the OECD website, you can see that there are more than 200 institutions that try to apply behavioral insights to public policy. For example, in London, we have the famous Behavioral Insights Units, that it's also called the nudge unit, because of this dominance of nudging among the behavioral public policies. And one reason why behavioral public policy and nudging gain popularity is also due to this idea that they are based on sound evidence that comes from RCTs. So this is one idea, and so this is why I think it's an ideal case to study challenges to evidence-based policy, because these are supposedly good examples of evidence-based policies. So first argument, like how to identify evidence. So as I said, here I want to compare different theoretical perspectives, bounded rationality and ecological rationality perspectives. So they have something in common, which is they both came out as a reaction to standard neoclassical models of decision making, according to which we individuals optimize when we make decisions. So we try to find a solution that maximizes our utility according to standard models. According to bounded rationality and ecological rationality perspectives, actually, we rely on a high number of heuristics when we make decisions. We don't optimize, Simon would say we satisfice, we rely on simple mechanisms that help us deal with the complexity of the environment. So this is what they have in common, but they also have a big difference in the sense that bounded rationality perspective focuses on mistakes that we make when we rely on these heuristics, and in particular cognitive biases. So the idea is that by relying on these simple mechanisms, we systematically deviate from optimal decisions. We make mistakes. These are cognitive biases. While according to the ecological rationality perspective, heuristics are what make us smart to deal with, again, the complexity of the environment. So we are very efficient in making decisions, even if we don't optimize. Now, to make examples, first of all, a very simple example. Imagine to be at a fancy restaurant, how to choose the right meal from the menu. So according to standard models, if we want to optimize, we go through the list of the menu and we try to find the meal that maximizes our own utility. Okay, so in this case, we would be the rational optimizers. According to simple heuristics, actually, we might make decisions differently. So we don't even look at the menu. We just go, for example, we might go for always for the same option. Or we might choose something that has been chosen by our friend. We might ask the waiter, what is the best meal? So these are heuristics to make decisions. And according to ecological rationality, these are efficient, these are good heuristics. According to the bounded rationality perspective, it's not rational to go for an option, like to go for, I don't know, the foie gras if we are having lunch alone, and to go for the veggie pie if we are having lunch with other people. This is like an error, it's inconsistent. And rationality, according to economists, because this is a reaction to economists, you might say, is like consistency in revealing preferences, you might say. And so this would be inconsistent. And so the same dynamics, the same facts are interpreted very differently from, like, depending on what is your theoretical premise. Now, to make another example, which is a bit more, like, a bit closer to what I'm doing, not about the restaurant. So, together with Nicola Bellet and Paola Cantarelli, we started to work on this principle of bounded subadditivity. You can see the definition here. An event has greater impact when it turns impossibility into possibility, or possibility into certainty, than when it merely makes a possibility more or less likely. So we have published an experiment about this principle. Here I will show you another experiment that we are working on, that is the part of the experiment, which was done on healthcare workers in Italy. And basically we asked to make decisions about participation to organizational projects with different probabilities of success. And the hypothesis, consistent with the bounded subadditivity principle, individuals are willing to spend more hours on a job project when their contribution turns the success of the initiative from impossible to possible, or from possible to certain, relative to when their contribution merely makes success more likely. So a few examples here from the experiment. This is the vignette that was shown to subjects, to healthcare workers in Italy. So imagine that a group of colleagues, maybe you cannot read, invites you to participate in an organizational change project. Without your contribution, the probability of success of the project is, and here we manipulated the probability of success of the project. So you can imagine here 4 random groups, either 0%, or 1%, or 98%, or 99%. With your contribution, the probability of success can increase up to, and it was constant, the contribution, so 1 percentage point to the project in the success, in the probability of success. And so it just changed the starting point. So from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, from 98 to 99, from 99 to 100. By moving the slider below, indicate how many hours you would be willing to dedicate to the project in the next year, necessarily subtracting them from other activities. Okay, so here the results for the first 3 groups. We don't observe any, what they call, possibility effect. So there is no significant difference between group 1, group 2, and group 3. Partially not confirmed, bounded subadditivity, but there is a certainty effect. So they are willing to spend more hours on the project that turns possibility into certainty, basically. Their contribution turns possibility into certainty. Now, this is, these are facts, you might say. We realize that there are different ways to interpret this. And so you might, depending on your point of view, you might say that this is rational or not. So you might say from an organizational point of view, 1 percentage point in the probability of success is worth the same regardless of the starting point, because there are so many projects in an organization. So in expectation, there is no difference in working on this project or this project. But there might be reasons to attach a value to certainty for example, from the individual point of view. And so also, like in the lexicon, there are differences in interpreting these dynamics. So some people call it zero risk bias, like it was an error consistent with the bounded rationality approach. Some people call it certainty premium, like it makes sense to attach a premium on certainty. And so this is the first point that I want to make. Same facts can be interpreted very differently depending on the theoretical approach. Yes, excuse me. Excuse me? Okay, so I have to repeat the question because they cannot hear you. So the question is, how can how this, like the same fact can be interpreted differently? So from the bounded rationality perspective, you can call it zero risk bias because you might say it doesn't make much sense to put more effort in this project, because in expectation you will have like the same increase in the success. So you just increase by 1 project over like 100 projects, regardless of the starting point. You might say, and even if you ask open questions to the respondents and you ask them to justify their choices, they tell you, well, yes, but I want to be seen as the successful guy, and if I have the possibility to have certain success, whatever it costs, I will put like the highest level of effort on the certainty in the success of the program. So you might also say that this is a very simple scenario. In the real world, these probabilities are quite unlikely to exist. And so certainty is something that is really different from a probabilistic outcome. Because in the real world, you never have 98% of the probabilities when you make decisions. And so an ecologically rational behavior would be, okay, when you are certain about something, risk doesn't exist because something can happen that actually might change the environment in which I'm making this decision. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so this is, again, first argument. Now, moving to the second argument. So now let's say that we forget about ecological rationality and we only take the bounded rationality perspective, meaning we are boundedly rational and we are affected by cognitive biases. So irrational behavior is among us. How shall we deal with it? And my argument is that the decision on how to deal with irrationality can depend on the context. And so to make this argument, I use this cultural theory by Mary Douglas. So it comes from anthropology. Main idea is that, so Mary Douglas proposes a model of 4 different cultural types based on 2 dimensions. One is greed, and that is to what extent people's life is governed by rules, and the other is group. So to what extent people's lives is governed by group membership, so to what extent we like to feel part of a group, basically. And based on these 2 dimensions, Mary Douglas proposes these 4 cultural types. You can see here when you are high on both group and greed, you have hierarchy. When you are low on greed, so basically we don't like rules, but we like group, we are egalitarian, according to Mary Douglas. Low group and low greed, it's an individualistic world. And low group and high greed, it's fatalism. So basically rules exist, but we don't have any control over rules. And that's why fatalism. So my argument here is that using these 4 cultural types, the evidence that we are not rational, that we are affected by cognitive biases, might be used differently. And nudging, which again is the now most famous way to use this evidence that we are affected by cognitive biases, I argue is consistent with hierarchy. And it's consistent with hierarchy because it needs a degree of faith on experts to fix the irrational behavior of citizens. So basically, the premise of nudging is that we can design and implement rational nudges to fix the behavior of irrational citizens. And if you are not familiar with nudging, a simple example, when I was hired by LSE, by default, I was enrolled in a private pension scheme. And so they changed, in the UK, they changed the default. New employees are automatically enrolled in private pension schemes. I'm still free to opt out from the system, and I don't have to pay any cost for that, apart from sending an email to the HR. And that is an example of nudges. So still free to choose whatever you want, but there is the policymakers are trying to push you towards a specific direction, which is saving money for the future, basically. Because people don't do it. People are irrational because they only care about today. And so this is the idea, to use choice architecture to fix irrational behavior. Now, I try to argue that there are alternatives to use this evidence of irrational behavior, and I propose some alternatives. For example, individualism. Of course, here the solution is always competition and incentives. So basically, here the argument would be if we are making mistakes, those who are making mistakes will fail, and so there will be a learning process, and irrationality will disappear thanks to the incentives that are involved in a competitive mechanism. Egalitarianism, here I put the word inclusion. So to mention one author that might argue in favor of this approach, Peter John and Nudge Plus. They are trying to say that nudging is a bit, let's say, naive in relying on this idea of irrational behavior from citizens and rational behavior of policymakers. So maybe trying to let people understand why they are making mistakes in their decisions. So enhancing information, trying to enhance participation in the decision-making process will help them change their irrational behavior. So basically this is an argument in favor in what I see as an egalitarian argument. In that sense, sharing the visions of many people so that there will be this learning process by sharing these different points of view. And then fatalism. So fatalism, it's always, let's say, not that interesting when talking about public policy, because fatalists usually like to show that things don't work. So here I put muddling through, meaning that the argument would be there is no systematic way to escape irrationality, and so the best you can do is try to come up with ad hoc responses ex post. So once you observe errors, once you observe mistakes, you can try to fix those mistakes and those errors, but this is just like there is no systematic way to anticipate irrational behavior. And so this would be my second argument. I should say that this is something that I'm still thinking about. So particular because of like this idea of nudging being consistent with hierarchy, I know that some people who work within this field of nudging might feel offended by seeing them, like by putting themselves here within hierarchy. And they would argue, why not command and control, consistent with hierarchy? And I see the argument. Here I didn't include command and control. Probably I should. I was trying to think in terms of behavioral strategies to public policy. But yeah, this is something that is still in progress, let's say. So to sum up, what I was trying to do was trying to show that, as usual, evidence-based policy can be appealing as a concept when we study public policy. We always want to believe that we can improve public policy, but this is hard, it's difficult, there are many challenges, and I tried to use the case of behavioral public policy to show that first to identify evidence, it's difficult. So there is a debate that happens within the academic community, and it's not that easy to find evidence without any ambiguity. And secondly, that even when you have evidence, then the decision on how to use that evidence can be subject to controversial points, and it's highly dependent on the context. This is my second argument, and I think I'm stopping here. Thank you. Thank you.